Hi, welcome. My name is Lauren Fritsch, and today's video is the first in a series I'm doing about mental health and business, specifically through the lens of an entrepreneur who's experienced multiple mental health challenges over the course of my entrepreneurship. I started out working for myself when I was 23. That's nearly 2 decades ago. And I've also experienced eating disorder, exercise addiction, body dysmorphia, PTSD, complex PTSD, and postpartum depression. So I think I have a little bit of experience to share. And at the same time, I've simultaneously had a business and clients and relationships, a family. And I want to share a little bit from my perspective in hopes that it A, opens up a conversation, and B, perhaps can help someone else out there. And today's video is really about why I'm doing it, what you can expect, and who I am. And I'll go into more depth on my own journey later on. But first of all, why do this? Do I need to do this? What's the point of doing this? For me, I really value self-expression. I also think that it's vitally important that we as humans talk about our lived experience. And I started out 10 years ago with a YouTube channel specifically because I wanted to share with people my very alternative, contrarian approaches to healing and recovery from an eating disorder. And that's why my YouTube handle is Bulimia Betty, and it still is, and I'm not changing it. And at many points along the path, I've had well-meaning individuals ask me, should you take down those videos about eating disorders? Like, are you sure it's okay? And I was like, yes, not only is it okay, but also it is perfect. Do you know that like every one of my CEO clients comes to me after we do a coaching session and they're like, by the way, I watched your videos. And I'm like, great, I'm so happy. These guys do not have eating disorders. But I think that what is specific is also universal. Everyone has struggles. And I would argue that even if you don't have a quote unquote mental illness, and I hate that term, I'll talk about that later, I do believe that we have what I call sort of layers of mental wellness challenges. And the ones that we're most used to stigmatizing are the ones that are quote unquote clinical, the ones that we can diagnose using the DSM as a guideline. But so many people are functioning below that at what I call subclinical mental health challenges. And the subclinical is where we have a massive opportunity to help people heal, to help them have more enjoyable, productive, lower stress, trauma mitigated, I'm not going to say trauma-free, lives. And so yes, I will talk about the clinical aspects of mental health challenges, but I also want to say to anyone who maybe can't necessarily get diagnosed as having like panic disorder, there's a subclinical level that speaks to a lot of people in our general population. So one of the main reasons that this conversation is important to me is because mental health is really for everyone. Like, we all should want to have optimal mental wellness, right? And in having this conversation, I really want to destigmatize both the clinical level and the subclinical levels of mental health challenges. Another reason I'm doing this is that last year, and it continues, we don't know what's going to happen with India yet, but last year marked a really pivotal time in our culture, a period of very collective trauma. And yes, for some, the trauma was less severe, and for others, it was quite a bit more. But when you layer the trauma of the pandemic with the trauma of life completely changing, with the trauma of racial violence, we have just this massive source of pain that we have all collectively experienced and participated in, whether we realize it or not, whether it has quote unquote directly impacted us or not. We are living in an atmosphere of a collective trauma. over the past year and change. And so we will continue to unpack what is the legacy of 2020 for many years to come. And I hope that the discussions that I have on my video series will help you contextualize what you're experiencing and perhaps give you some resources that might be helpful, and point you in the right direction if you need to provide resources for someone else. The third reason I'm doing this, and I spoke to it a bit already, is that I firmly believe that we need to normalize our humanity and showing up as our full selves in every realm of our lives. So I'm posting this to LinkedIn. Some people would be horrified if their boss knew about their mental health challenges in the workplace. It could really harm them. And I want to start pushing an agenda that there's no difference between announcing a cancer diagnosis and a postpartum depression diagnosis. I want there to be no judgmental difference in those, no quantitative difference. In the former, there is support, there's an outpouring of compassion. Well, if you're with a good employer, right? There are friends who are lining up to bake you meals and sending you care packages specifically for your disease. And when you announce something like, oh, I have postpartum depression, first of all, who announces it? Like, no one. And then second of all, what do people do? Nothing. And I think that we have an example for us, actually, sadly, and most unfortunately, in an amazing woman and a humanitarian, Meghan Markle, who went to her employer, went to the royal staffers and said, this was not postpartum, it was prepartum, and said, I need help, I am struggling. And instead of getting this woman the help she needed, they shut her down and isolated her further. So we see how even people who have incredible resources, both internal and external, can still get stymied by these systems of oppression and suppression that make it an unfriendly landscape in which to share the very real traumas and realities of how those traumas play out in our lives and in our bodies, in our brains. So to me, this is a super, super important topic. And I hope that you'll join me over the next few videos. I have no idea how many videos it's going to be. I don't know, let's say 3. I'm going to do my best to stay fairly slow in my delivery. One of the things that I believe in is that for many of us, our central nervous systems are hijacked almost all the time. The modern world does that. Social media does that. Having the constant specter of some, existential threat does that. Trauma does that. Sometimes things that we put in our bodies or do with our bodies destabilizes the central nervous system. So the last thing I want to do while you're watching these videos is to jack up your central nervous system. If anything, I want you to be able to come away from these with a bit more calm. So to that end, I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to take a deep breath, and I invite you to do that with me. So feel free to close your eyes if that's available to you. And really focus on the out breath. It's actually not so much about the in breath, right? When you breathe in, you actually jazz up your heart rate, not let it simmer down. And so when you really focus on blowing out, that's when your system's getting the cue to relax. You'll automatically breathe in. You don't have to focus too hard on that. So periodically, as I'm presenting some of these ideas, I will refer to my notes. I will take a deep breath. I will take a minute. I do these in one take. I don't want to splice things together to get like the most ideal situation. I think for me, it's important just to be super authentic. So with that, who am I? My name's Lauren. I'm 40 years old. I normally live in New York City with my family. I have a husband and a almost 7-year-old. She would tell you that she is nearly 6 3/4. And we relocated for temporarily to Las Terrenas in the Dominican Republic. It's a small beach town, and there are lots of reasons we did that. You can watch a video on my Facebook page about it. I'm not going to go into it, but rest assured, it's a place for our nervous systems to chill out. And we have full-time in-person school because it is an open-air school, and it's awesome. We got here in September of 2020. I grew up in North Carolina and went to boarding school in both North Carolina and Massachusetts, and then went to college, was a college athlete at a really great program in rowing in Virginia. And then I've lived in Italy. I've worked and done business in 4 languages. I've run my own consulting firm as a coach and a consultant since 2005. And prior to that, I was more of a freelancer. So 17 years in business, and I have had, multiple highs and lows. And again, you can watch more videos if you want to hear about the business end of it. And yet, I was always very high functioning. So, National Merit Scholar, scholarships to college, Division I athlete, rush chair of my sorority, participating in student government, working with CEOs who run billion-dollar organizations, figuring it out. And I think that the image that we have of people who have mental health challenges is one that is not that type of person. And so I call it the high functioning individual. And so I'm going to speak from the perspective of the entrepreneur who is a high functioning individual and also challenged by mental health. So I spoke to this earlier. In college, I had an eating disorder. I have to, it's a list. I have to refer to it. I had an eating disorder with exercise addiction. After college, I healed during college, and that alone is anathema. A lot of people say you have an eating disorder for a lifetime. Not true, or it doesn't have to be. And after college, I sort of made my way. I was always interested in growth and development. And what I didn't realize was going on for me is that I was experiencing the fallout of something called complex PTSD. You might not be familiar with it. I'm not going to define it here, but complex PTSD is what happens when you have ongoing trauma during your developmental years. So more during childhood and young adulthood. I also had PTSD from a sexual assault that occurred in 2003 after I left college. And I experienced, unfortunately, a couple more sexual assaults, which really were quite destabilizing. And what ended up happening, it was a perfect storm of CPTSD, complex PTSD, coming to a head with PTSD, with postpartum depression after I had my first kid. And it took me many years to untangle those threads. But I want you to know that those are the things I was diagnosed with, if you will, because those are things that people can start to get their arms around, even though there's still a lot of misunderstanding around some of those terms. But I do want you to know that that was part of my experience. And, I've experienced suicidal ideation, wanting to kill myself, and, having risky behaviors as a result of some of this trauma. And I will speak at length to the specifics of them, because I do think sharing my specific story is helpful for others. And I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on my recovery process, because it's very idiosyncratic and it's worked several times. So do I wish that I didn't have to deal with it? Yeah, of course. But as someone who gathers a lot of data in my business life and then reverse engineers those outcomes and says, what did we do over and over again to get these results? And now can we make it repeatable? For me, doing the same on my mental wellness is super fun, which is so weird, but yay, I'm glad that I have that capacity because I'm really excited to share what worked for me in the past. And again, even if you don't have these things that have acronyms to describe them, if you identify with that concept of the subclinical challenges, guess what? A lot of the tools are the same. So that's a little bit about me. I do want to talk a little bit about what I believe, because I think it's super important for you to situate what my belief system is. So, number one, I fundamentally believe that healing is possible. Does that mean that you will never be on meds? No, maybe you will be. Does it mean that you will never get triggered again? Probably not. We all get triggered. We're human and we live in the world. We have bodies, right? We have central nervous systems. They're meant to be triggered. There's a reason for it. It's called survival. That said, I believe that healing is possible, and I use that part of speech super purposefully. ING, healing. It's an ongoing thing. We are going to have periods of time of expansion when our healing process feels good and juicy and it's working. We are going to have times of contraction in that healing process when it feels hard. We're in the muck. We can't see our way out. But I do want to say that healing process is cyclical, right? And you can move, I call it going from the chronic, so chronic PTSD, chronic CPTSD, chronic postpartum depression, chronic eating disorder, moving into a cycle of completion, right? Where you can move to a place where you have a greater capacity to function in a way that is healthy. It doesn't mean that you are perfect. It doesn't mean that you are done. It just means that you've moved through into a cycle of completion. So that's what I mean when I say that healing is possible. Healing always, not healed, healing. Number two, and this goes back to why I'm doing this also, is that I believe how we approach mental illness, and again, I'm going to talk about that word in another video, but how we approach mental illness culturally and in business is, to quote ESPN, a Travisham mockery. It's ridiculous. Why is it ridiculous? Mental illness is a punchline. And I don't want to go all PC on everybody, but we use words like crazy, schizo, insane. I use words like that so flippantly, we don't even think about it. They are part of our cultural lexicon, and we don't even realize what they really mean. And so mental illness has become a punchline. We have these images ingrained in our heads of people in straitjackets, drugged up on psych wards. And so then when someone close to us or we are experiencing something that feels scary, that feels too big, that we cannot manage, and we reach out for help, we go immediately to the cultural definitions of mental illness, which is incapacitated, drugged, lack of autonomy, imprisoned, right? Non-functioning. And those mischaracterizations, those punchlines are dangerous, especially for people who are high functioning. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that in another video, because any entrepreneur who also has mental health challenges is going to be high functioning. And I've seen it over and over again. And it's impressive, but it's also so unnecessary to hold yourself to such high standards. And it makes getting treatment often way more difficult. One of the other reasons I think that how we approach mental illness is such a Travisham mockery, that's such a good word, is the judgment. And I said earlier the comparison of how people are treated if they have a physical illness versus a mental illness, and the differences are so night and day, especially in the workplace. And, another reason that we have these challenges is that the DSM, which is a diagnostic manual, it's a diagnostic tool, it can't even begin to get its arms around the incredible spectrum that is human experience that comprises what we call mental illness. For example, when I was in college, I called up my parents at like some ungodly hour, like 3 o'clock in the morning. And I'm an early bird. I go to bed at like 8:30. My parents were like, and the dog's awake and my mom's like, what do you want? And I'm like, I need to go. This is my senior year of college. I'm like, I need to go to an eating disorder recovery facility. Like now. I can't do this anymore. And at the time, I lived in a historical part of the University of Virginia. I had no bathroom. So to be bulimic without a bathroom is quite a challenge, let me tell you. It's a gross challenge. I rose to the occasion. And I won't go into the details of how I managed that, but I knew that I had a problem because I was binging constantly. And I was staring down, looking at graduation, some, let's say 9 months away, and going, am I going to carry this with me into my adult life? Like, that's terrifying. And so that's why I called my parents. This freaked them out completely. They didn't know what to do. And my dad talked to like one of his nutritionist friends because he's in the wellness space. And she said, oh, she doesn't have an eating disorder. So my dad calls me back and he's like, oh, I checked with my friend. You don't have an eating disorder because you don't satisfy the criteria laid out in the DSM, which at the time, I can't remember what it was, but you have to have lost this much body weight and be binging this many times a day. And it was a whole like bullet point list. And he was like, because you don't have that, don't worry. You're good. You don't have an eating disorder. We now call that gaslighting, denying someone's lived experience. However, that's not the point. My dad was trying to help, right? He was trying to reassure me that the problem was not that big. He was trying to reassure himself and my mom that the problem was not that big. But ultimately, like I said, the DSM and the diagnostic criteria that is drilled into the minds of the LCSWs and the psychologists and the psychiatrists who are trying their best cannot begin to encompass the complexity of a human's experience. And so I fundamentally think that categories like the DSM, that, the DSM promoting categories and categorization of mental illness can be helpful to a small degree, but at a certain point it has outlasted its efficacy. And for true healing, we have to work with professionals who are willing to look beyond that. Also, it does nothing to address the subclinical, which you've already heard me speak about. And in fact, the subclinical people just get, sort of shunted to the side. When imagine the loss of creation and relationship and humanity that is happening because those subclinical people are not able to get the help they need. It's kind of shitty. All right. So the next thing that I want to say, tied into why I think how we approach mental illness in our culture is a complete Travisham mockery, is because guess what, y'all? Everybody is dysfunctional. Everybody has trauma. And while I do say that there is no hierarchy of suffering, so one person's, let's say, violent assault is another person's years of silent treatment, and there's no way to make those quantifiably be, give one more weight than the other in a human. There are some traumas that extract more from their victims than others, from the survivors. And it's important for us to understand, in order to have empathy, that everyone is walking around with a trauma, whether they know it or not, whether they would label it that or not. And everyone, every single human being is dysfunctional in some way. And For those who have seen me in a corporate space, you know, I say that companies are just made up of dysfunctional people, and the larger the company grows, the more the dysfunction actually grows exponentially. It's a J curve. So because all that just multiplies, right? So when we start to acknowledge some of these things, then we can start to change how we approach them. But if we go on la 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 as if there's no problem, then we can't even begin to start the process of change. I have a couple more thoughts, and but I'll get to those on the next video, but I want to just say this last point, and I'm going to expand on this in another video too, is that healing our own trauma, taking responsibility for our own functionality, is an act of leadership. What does that mean? Someone asked me what this means, and here's how I want to give you just a little bit, because we will dive into it. When we heal our own trauma, when we take responsibility for our own functionality, we start to model behaviors that are unusual, that take other people by surprise, that might even offend other people. We give strong no's with no other context. We set boundaries that are healthy. We use healthy communication styles. We refrain from having hidden expectations, being passive aggressive, being overtly aggressive. When we are triggered, we acknowledge it, and then we look into why and what we can do about it. When we operate from that perspective, we become leaders of ourselves. We begin to master ourselves. And when we begin to master ourselves, we can then be leaders of others. I have historically worked with a lot of CEO men, and some of them have beautifully managed their growth process, and some of them have not. And the difference is so palpable in their organizations as well as in their families. And so when I say that healing our own trauma is an act of leadership, I know it because I've seen it in process. And I would just leave that as a concept with you. Leadership is not the stuff that we make it out to be. Making the right strategic decision at the right time, being a figurehead, being in the media. It's really a series of micro choices over time towards integration of our past experiences and towards deconditioning ourselves from all the erroneous beliefs and triggers that make us do crazy stuff that doesn't make sense, towards a place of integration. And that's real leadership. When instead of behaving according to past patterns, habitual patterns that may or may not be healthy but are just habit, we can operate in the moment from a place of equanimity, wisdom, love, composure. I think that's a good enough list. That's leadership. That's leadership in action. And so I want us to hold ourselves accountable to that level of leadership. And I want us to hold our leaders, the people who are in positions of leadership, I want us to hold them accountable to that as well. So that's what I've got for today. I have some more things I'm going to share. And I look forward to hearing your comments, questions, critiques, whatever you got. Holler in the comments below. Thank you.